Right, thank you everyone for attending, all of you virtually. My name is Jim and I'm here to talk to you about a hacker's view of data breaches. So a little bit about me, I've worked at a bunch of places over the last 10 and 15 years or so, predominantly in tech, but before that I had a whole other life in the arts sector, most recently in Whānau Marama, the New Zealand International Film Festival. So yeah, 9 years in tech, 5 as a developer, 4 in cybersecurity. My current role is a senior security consultant at PrivSec Consulting, which basically means I hack things. My official title is penetration tester, which means I try and find my way into things like web applications or internal networks. Like I said, I'm a former software developer, so sorry if you've ever had to use anything that I've made. I also help organise ISIG, which is the Information Security Interest Group, which meets up at the Thistle Inn in Wellington on the last Thursday of every month. I'm an active security researcher, which means I hack things in my spare time. I've got a bunch of CVEs that have been credited, which are common vulnerability and exposures, which are basically a known and widespread bug. So some of my more recent ones have been in Blackboard, Kramer, Moodle, Outlook, Visual Studio, Microsoft Excel, and Microsoft Word. As of this week, I think the Microsoft Security Response Center are very, very sick of me. They're the ones who I report the vulnerabilities to. I'm also a frequent flyer with CERT, the Cybersecurity Emergency Response Team. They are the real MVP of cybersecurity in Aotearoa, and they definitely aren't sick of me, and they're great. Please don't ask me about council software. Cool. So one thing we used to say when I first started as a pen tester was this website is one curious hacker away from a major data breach. And what that basically means is we'd come across a website, we'd start manipulating it in ways and vulnerabilities would start to fall out. And that's how I sort of started thinking about how actual breaches happen and how straightforward it is. So we're going to be looking at a few things today, the OWASP Top 10 and Principle 5 of the 2020 Privacy Act. We're sort of going to be tying those together. We're going to be looking at access control issues in the OWASP Top 10, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. We're going to be looking at broken access control, injection type attacks, security misconfigurations, how nothing ever disappears from the internet, which is generally bad, what you can do if you find something on the internet, and a lot of what we're going to talk about are quite simple hacks and techniques that can have really impactful outcomes. So the OWASP has a top 10 most common web application vulnerability list, which they put out every couple of years. That changes from time to time as and when trends change and attack classes change and bug classes change. So the first one we're going to talk about is broken access controls. There's cryptographic failures, injection, that sort of stuff. And the Privacy Act in 2020, which will be very familiar to all of you, not so much me, because I'm on the security side of things. It replaced the 1993 Privacy Act. It was designed to strengthen privacy protections. It now has requirements around reporting breaches, criminal offences, and the Commissioner can now issue compliance notices. There's also a lot of other changes that went in. It has 13 principles, and number 5, which is the most related to this talk, is about the security and storage of information. So some more definitions, just to clarify what we talk about when we're talking about breaches. A lot of people use these terms interchangeably, but they are slightly different. Data breach is someone has stolen data. A confidentiality breach, someone has stolen secret data. And a privacy breach, which is when someone has stolen personal data. When breaches are talked about, they can often be all three, they can just be one, they can be a couple of different types. And they're used relatively interchangeably when people report on these. Some of the techniques you will see are illegal. Unless you have prior consent from the website owner, you're participating in a bug bounty program, or you're practicing in a lab environment, please don't do crimes. There are safe ways to go and practice these things. And if you do accidentally stumble across something, we will talk about what to do to tell someone when you do that. Cool. So between the principle number 5 and the OWASP top 10, we should have some guardrails to help keep people's data safe. Doesn't always work like that, and that's what we're here to talk about. So principle number 5, in brief, is basically don't use it, misuse it, or disclose it. The Act, or the principle number 5, basically says any agency that holds personal information, you have to protect it, essentially, and make sure that other people don't use it. The OWASP Top 10 is basically a list of key vulnerability classes within software that may lead to a security breach. Not all of them relate to privacy and data breaches, but a lot do. Things like broken access control, injection, or insecure design, and logging and monitoring failure. And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. So A term that comes up in the OWASP top 10 is something called access control. And in a computing environment, it basically means who or what can use or otherwise modify a thing. Sometimes access control is role-based, so you might have an administrator, you might have a super administrator, you might have a low privilege user or a guest account. And depending on how the software is designed, you might have something where everything's open by default, you might have a document server where everything's denied by default, and it varies a lot in complexity, and it really depends on the system that you're looking at where the access control lies. So every year OWASP test a bunch of applications, and 94% of the last round of testing had some form of broken access control. So what is it? It can be as simple as changing a number in a URL bar by 1, or it can be more complex, such as tampering with data with an authentication mechanism, such as a JSON Web Token. Or it could be something as simple as me, a non-administrator user, typing /admin into the URL bar and being able to see administration areas. So, or in the case of the Optus data breach, you're just able to update or retrieve data of another user just by adding a number. So a friend of mine who I used to work with, I asked him how his holiday was, and he had gone out to rent a car. So he had signed up to this rental place, he had submitted his documents, his driver's license and some other personal information. They got emailed a link to their documents. They noticed the URL took the following form, s3.nameofrental.com/documents/a number. And because this person was a hacker, they made the mistake of incrementing that integer. And so their holiday started off with a round trip to the cybersecurity emergency response team because they saw someone else's driver's license. I was on a job about a year ago for a document processing company. I came across a large amount of document processing. So I found a link to a document using a tool called GAL, which stands for Get All URLs, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the document IDs were random GUIDs, which stands for globally unique identifier, which is good because they basically look like a long random string and they're essentially not guessable. So I clicked on the document and I was asked for a PIN number and I was like, oh, this is great. It's a security control. And so I went, okay, I don't have a PIN. I clicked the button and it said, okay, what's your email? So I got emailed a PIN and then it said, okay, enter that PIN. I entered that PIN, and then I got generated a session cookie, which is a little bit of few characters that allow the browser to send and to access information. So then I used my newly minted session cookie, and I found a part of the website that took integers, and we all know what we do with integers, and there was no access control. So we uncovered around 500,000 documents that were accessible through this technique, and it went back around 5+ years. So I called the client straight away, and they fixed it within a few days, and hopefully by now they've had a really good look at what their data retention policy is. So this was on a pen test job, so this is the sort of thing that we do. We try and find data breaches before they happen. One of the first development jobs I had was at homes.co.nz, and I'm really sorry for helping to break the property market. If anyone here has come across the browser-based tool called Inspect Element, it's a way of editing the HTML and JavaScript in the browser. I realized I could update a property by enabling a button that was claimed by someone else. And this is the sort of access control that hackers try and manipulate because you can use it to escalate privileges. And last week, I escalated from a low privilege user to an administrator using a slightly flashier version of this. And if you manage to escalate privileges within a web application, you have all the data. So a well-known data breach that actually happened using this sort of technique was in September 2022. Optus is one of Australia's largest telcos, and the names, addresses, dates of birth, passports, driver's license of 10 million people, approximately a third of Australia, was leaked and someone tried to sell it. Optus described it as an insecure API. API stands for Application Programming Interface, which is a way for computers to talk to each other. This API allowed for incrementing integers and didn't have any access control in place. So 10 million network requests doesn't take that long. So Optus apologized and put aside 140 million Australian dollars and said, sorry. So yeah. Cool. Number 3 in the OWASP top 10 is injection. So injection attacks can happen whenever untrusted client data, namely the things you put in your browser, make it somewhere bad, like a database, and they're not filtered or sanitized on the way there. If this untrusted data that isn't filtered or sanitized it makes it to the database, it can be interpreted by the database and a user can issue their own instructions. The most common is SQL, which is known as structured query language injection. And this is a programming language that's used to talk to relational databases. A few years ago, there was a big breach, a credit reporting agency called Equifax, 143 million users. These issues had been disclosed previously, but ultimately it was an SQL injection bug that got all the data. But security researchers 6 months before had disclosed a bunch of SQL injection and access control issues that allowed for retrieving other people's information, and they didn't do anything until the breach happened. Some of this talk was written while waiting for a database to finish dumping on a client job, so it's still very much a thing and it's still very much out there in the wild. This is kind of low-hanging fruit, but there's a technique called Google dorking, which is a way of constructing a Google search to find very specific things. And here I asked Google for in URL, which means can you find me all the things in the URL that look like product-list.php with what's called a query string, that little question mark, and it came back with a few results. And I clicked on Phoenix medical equipment.sa, and then I put in a single quote because SQL injections tend to happen when you put in single or double quotes, and then a little error message came back, which told me that it had been sent all the way to the data layer into the database. And so at that point, I just walked away because I'm not going to do crimes. One of my first jobs as a pen tester, I was working on a payments and rates application for a local government client, pretty important stuff. It was a brand new web application. I found SQL injection. It was a type of injection known as error-based that allows for data to come out really, really quickly, and it was very easy to find. And thankfully, it was in a pre-production state, which means that they were able to remedy and fix the issue before deploying to production and releasing it for members of the public to use, which was really, really good, the best possible outcome. Cool. So data breaches can lead to other data breaches. We're going to talk a little bit about a technique called credential stuffing, which is when people use the same password across multiple sites. When I first started in cybersecurity, we had access to multiple data breaches because one of the things we used to do when we were on client jobs was just make sure that people weren't reusing passwords that were caught up in breaches. So I made the mistake of looking at my parents. And if you've ever heard the term password child, I was not the password child. And as it turned out, my mum had my brother's name and my dad had the dog's name. So that was, yeah, it's okay, I'll be fine. Anyway, data breaches can lead to other data breaches. So obviously, if a lot of people are using passwords between sites, and if you're caught up in one breach, your password may be used to access other sites. At the end of 2023, 23andMe, the DNA collection startup collected, they have six or 7 million people who had signed up to this thing, and they managed to get, the attackers managed to get 14,000 accounts. But because of the design of the site and how all the users were, allowing their information to be shared, the records of several million people were compromised. And so 14,000 people had reused passwords from other breaches. So it's a very, very common type of attack. And it, definitely happens in the wild. So one of the questions I often get asked when we have the bad news of delivering a penetration test report is, how can we make it better? How can we influence good practice? So when you're building software, there's a thing called the software development lifecycle, which is basically moving JIRA tickets around until work gets done. Software has the concept of something called acceptance criteria, which is all the things that need to happen before a feature can be made. And if you're doing Agile, the idea of a use case implies the existence of a misuse case. So perhaps you could create both. And also consider having privacy-based use cases. What is the minimum subset of data? How long are you going to store it for? Where are you going to store it? And who's going to be able to view it? So if you capture privacy and security in user stories and unit tests, you're going to end up with a much more robust piece of software on the other side. So something that gets raised in pen test reports a lot is a type of bug called username enumeration. And what this means is it's really common in a forgot password form. You go, I've forgot my password, and you type in a name of a user that doesn't exist. And then the application tells you that user doesn't exist in the application. Generally, we raise it as a low finding, but it's so context dependent because in a justice or a jury application, the existence of a user within an application suddenly becomes a much bigger deal. In 2015, a software engineer figured out they could send an iMessage to an MP using iMessage. And that basically they would enter first name dot last name at aph.gov.au, and based on whether the message said delivered or not, they could send them a message directly to their handset. And eventually MPs figured out how to delink their email addresses from their phones after a lot of harassment and abuse. So a common thing for accounting software to do, and this is how nothing ever disappears from the internet, is people share links to invoices. So this is by design. You shouldn't have to log in to view an invoice. I think that's a really great design decision, particularly by some of the bigger accounting companies. The fact that they don't make you have a username or login to collect it, that's pretty good. Some of the privacy and security controls involve either using a GUID, which is a globally unique identifier, or a UID, a universally unique identifier, to try and prevent brute forcing of URLs. So this is great. They've gotten around the integer problem. They've done it in a sensible way, and they're pretty unguessable. But anyone who's ever spent any length of time on the internet will notice that Google Chrome and other browsers essentially try and cache, which means to store everything that they've come across. So tools such as Gal, Get All URLs, which we talked about earlier, exist to find these. These are command line tools that search a lot of places. The Wayback Machine, archive.org, the Open Thread Exchange. If you feed the tool a URL such as in.xero.com or connect.intuit.com, you can suddenly see a host of invoices and companies and data. And this is the sort of thing that an attacker would look for, because it's very easily identifiable information. It's email addresses, it's bank account numbers, it's invoices, it's company names, company brands, everything associated to do with the ebb and flow of invoices. This is what it looks like. This wouldn't be a hacking talk without the hacker green. But essentially, once you run the tool, it comes back with a whole heap of addresses and URLs. And if you put one of them into your browser, you will get a slightly less redacted invoice, complete with all that identifiable information that you don't really want existing in the wild. And so that's, that generally happens because of this. So a couple of months ago, I had a CTO friend call me. CTO is a Chief Technology Officer. He was conducting phishing training on his staff, which is a really great thing to be doing. He was very proactive, very security minded. Even better is none of them were falling for it. He was spear phishing the accounts team, but what he discovered was something was clicking the links. So he called me up and he said, something's clicking the links. I am wondering if our email inbox has been compromised. And so we eventually got down to the root cause of what was doing it. And it turns out it was Google crawlers going through the inbox of his staff and following the links to cache things. And I don't know why Google does this, but that's how all those sort of zero URLs end up in places, because of crawlers, because of bots, because of things just trying to cache and store everything all the time. And it's not just overseas companies that have this issue either. There have been a lot of protracted discussions with Google, particularly between the local companies, because there are technical guardrails. There are headers that come back from the server when a browser or another client sends a request, and these headers take on the form of no cache and no store, which basically say, whatever you do with this data, don't store it, don't cache it, but for whatever reason, this doesn't seem to be working. So these are instructions from servers to crawlers and bots to say, please don't take this information. So these sorts of issues likely extend to things like Dropbox, Google Drive. I haven't looked, don't really want to look. Some have mitigations in place, such as expiration. Some invoices might expire after 14 days, but this isn't always the case. So AO5 is the next security misconfiguration it's called security misconfigurations, and it's in the OWASP top 10. So Azure and Amazon, the big cloud services providers, they have the concept of a bucket. And a bucket in this sense is just a place to put a bunch of files. This is a really normal thing. This is how the internet works. You need to be able to put files onto servers. A really common misconfiguration within these cloud services is leaving these buckets public and searchable, which is a really bad thing. So often, as we've discovered, these can contain all sorts of things. They can contain invoices, personal information, source codes and secrets, all sorts. So property managers, those bastions of security and privacy, one of them in particular, LPM Property Management in New Zealand, had what's known as an exposed public bucket. There were 30,000 pieces of information, passports and driver's license, were sitting in public view. So what would happen is people would apply for a rental property, they would submit their application and have to send in a scan or a photocopy or, a photo of passports and driver's licenses into the website, and the website would put them into one of these buckets, and the bucket was publicly searchable. Don't ask me why they were being stored on the web server or in the bucket. That seems like an inherently bad idea. A security researcher found these in May 2020 and sent them a little email to say, we have some public buckets. Perhaps you could do something about it. And in July, they front-footed it and said, yes, one of our internal team has discovered these buckets are public and we fixed it. Yeah, but it was the security researcher who notified the press and said, I told them about it and now they fixed it. Yeah, so a organization called Grey Hat Warfare have indexed billions of files on hundreds of thousands of buckets. This becomes an issue. I mean, it is an issue, and Microsoft had this issue a few weeks ago where they had left one open with lots of usernames and passwords for internal resources. And it's also happened to Netflix and a lot of other big companies. As you can see from the screenshot, there's something close to 11.9 billion files, and they've indexed about 2.7 billion of them. And yeah, you can search by extension, you can write regular expressions if you feel like punishing yourself. And you can look for all these tasty things in these buckets and just see what's there. So AO9, we're getting to the end. I'm sorry, I've speed run this a little bit. AO9 in the OWASP top 10 is known as security logging and monitoring failures. So what this basically means is, how do you know if someone's rattling your doorknobs? If you're a system administrator or you run a website or you run something that exists on the public internet, how do you know if someone is rattling your doorknobs? In 2023, the average length of time was around 204 days to detect a breach, which seems quite long. And I realized that I had experienced this in the wild. We were doing what's known as an external penetration test, which is where we look at an organization's overwhelming public footprint. We see what servers they have on the internet, what else they're running that an attacker can see from the public internet. We were able to gain access to one of the servers. This server existed within the organization. It was on the actual network, and we started to move inwards, and we gained something called domain administrator privileges. A domain administrator, it's essentially keys to the kingdom. That means you can access all the things, all the data, and it's a common target for ransomware operators. We called the client straight away to tell them we'd got in, and we heavily enumerated the domain. We just wanted to know what else was there to find as many bugs as possible in the time that we had. And about 3 months later, we received an email from another team in the client asking if we were testing in December. So the time from us doing the thing to the time of us being detected doing the thing was around 3 months. So slightly shorter than 204 days, but still not ideal. Oh, there are some questions, but I can't really see them, I'm sorry. Yeah, another thing to think about when people design software is sometimes a useful feature means that a lot of data is collected. So one thing that my boss pointed out, because we've just hired a new consultant. Yes, Amy, you've raised your hand. We've got some raised hands. We'll save it for the Q&A. I can't hear anything, sorry. Cool. So Seek has the ability to add your salary to the profile. It also lets employers know that you've seen the ad. It also lets employers know what your current salary is. And New Zealand is extremely small. I think there are about 200 penetration testers in New Zealand, according to the census. And so chances are you know about half of them if you work in cybersecurity. And this sort of data being collected and surfaced to employers means that you can see who's currently unhappy in their role and looking for a job. So sometimes the reason the data gets collected in the first place is due to things like dark development patterns. So these so-called dark patterns are things like confusing wording. This one at the bottom came from a designer friend of mine. Tick the relevant box if you do not wish to receive sale and other information relating to Next. I don't know about you, but the number of times that flip-flops in my head until I decide whether to click or not is a lot. And also the Instagram one saying, to provide a better ads experience, we need permission to use future activity that other apps and websites send us. That sounds delightful. So things like having to log in or create an account to unsubscribe or personalizing your ads. These are all ways that organizations like to capture your data. However, sometimes you do get to do work that makes things a little bit safer and decreases some risk. When I was working as a developer at Radio New Zealand, there was a section of the website known as formal complaints. And this is basically an opportunity for people who didn't like that Susie Ferguson did a swear. Susie Ferguson would never do a swear. But that sort of thing, they would fill out the formal complaints form and it would send an email off to someone and it would store some identifiable and some personal information on the web server. So I was asked, after some privacy discussions internally, to remove this from the server. And I said, this is great, let's do that. If the web server was compromised, it's one less thing to worry about. We don't have these people's information sitting in a database. So now it was send an email instead of dumping it into the content management system. This is an entirely different threat model. How secure is the formal complaints inbox? I'm not sure. So doing this work wasn't without its issues. I set a cron job, which is a scheduled task, to get rid of that database table at 2 a.m. The scheduled task timed out at 2:30 a.m. and some poor on-call engineer had to wake up and give the site a kick. All I can say is that it worked on my machine. I am very sorry. But there are no more formal complaints stored on the Radio New Zealand website. So, some things you can do about it. If you are a technologist and you are asked to implement something, you can always say no. At Radio New Zealand in 2019, I was asked to add some tracking JavaScript to the website. There was already a lot of places on this website that did a lot of tracking. But in the meeting with the Nielsen folks who had made this piece of JavaScript, I was told that it would be sending data to Facebook based on session information. Because Radio New Zealand was going through a phase where they needed to know how many people they were engaging with and they wanted audience segmentation data, this was appealing to them. So in return for sending Facebook session information off to Facebook about someone visiting Radio New Zealand, they would get segmentation data back about who was visiting the sites and how old they were and where they lived and all that sort of thing. I didn't think that a public broadcaster should be sending data to Facebook. Facebook already has all the data. They do not need any more. And I essentially told my team lead that I would not do the work unless there was a privacy policy in place that was public facing. About 2 months after that, the work still was not done. So I left to move to cybersecurity, which was probably for the best. And thankfully, there is now a privacy policy in place on the Radio New Zealand website. And they tell you what they collect, but it still seems like a lot. And I'll note that the Nielsen online site census, which is where people like Stuff and Radio New Zealand and the Herald all get to compare traffic, they get to compare all their visits and that sort of thing. They don't mention anything about Facebook on there. So either it is sending stuff to Facebook or they didn't update it. Yeah, still feels like a lot of things to collect for a public broadcaster. And finally, what do you do if you find something in the wild? Well, there is a standard called the security text standard, which is basically a file that tells you what to do if you find something wrong. And there's a picture of it down below. It tells you who to contact, tells you preferred languages, and it also shows you whether there's a privacy policy in place. More and more organizations are moving towards this. However, if they don't have a security text in the well-known folder, cert.gov.nz is a fantastic starting point if you see something that you should not see in the wild. The incident responders are extremely good and they will help you out. Cool. Sorry, that was a little bit faster than I intended. I was just very excited to talk about hacking and privacy. Thank you for coming. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and check the chats. Cool. Okay, we've got three. Yep. Thank you, Lee. We've got three Q&As from anonymous attendees, which I'll read out. Are you seeing changes in security and privacy risks with uptake of LLMs and similar tools? That was from anonymous attendee. Yes, absolutely. One of the big things about one of the biggest risks we personally see as a security consultancy would be if we were using a LLM or AI tool to proofread or check our reports, which we are not. Generally speaking, we would be worried about client data or sensitive data being zipped off to the cloud for further processing. And I think that's something a lot of people might not have necessarily thought about. Anything you type into ChatGPT then belongs to ChatGPT. So by using them, you're just giving them more data. So yeah, there are definitely some changes to the security and privacy risks. Does that answer your question, anonymous attendee? I hope so. Emma McCleary is going to answer this question live. Cool. How keen are organizations to know about risks and address them? And what drives these decisions? It really depends. Some organizations are very good at front-footing these sorts of things. They just want to rip the bandage off and fix them. Some organizations, and it really depends on what we call a level of maturity in the security space. A lot of organizations are sort of just starting out. They don't know what they don't know. So the first thing for them is to figure out what they actually have in their inventory. But generally speaking, it's a variety of things. For the private sector, it might be a software as a service company. They might have a big client that they want to onboard, and so they might need a penetration test report to, give a security bill of health. That sort of thing. For the public sector, it might be they've built a new greenfields thing and they just need some assurance, some risk assurance on it. And it really depends. But yeah, I love coming back to an organization a year later for their annual pen test. And not only have they fixed things, they've implemented like a lot more defense in depth and that kind of thing. So there's definitely a very strong trend to improving security, which is really, really good to see. Can you as a customer request to remove that data or not collect it? Great question. You can definitely request a website or an organization to remove the data. I tend to use ad blockers wherever possible. They tend to block things like Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. So it doesn't really collect that data. But yeah, it's really up to you versus the terms and conditions of whatever you're interacting with, I suppose. But that's a good question, Monica. Oh my God, I've got more of them. Okay, anonymous attendee, how should IT teams be storing passwords for multiple systems? Password managers, that's what we always recommend. Password managers with MFA enabled. So even if we do compromise a password manager, yeah, I would say that's the first thing we start with. We also, for MFA, recommend things like hardware-based tokens, things like YubiKeys, that are just little USB keys that sit in instead of the authenticator on your phone. Yeah, but yes, IT teams should be storing them in password managers with MFA enabled, or looking to go passwordless. There's pros and cons. It's always a trade-off of security versus usability. You want to be able to use the things without having to, cut and paste passwords all the time. So there are hardware-based tokens that can help you there. Do you have a sense of how much breach response work is privacy versus other stuff? Do organizations link up privacy and security work effectively? I'm not too sure on that. We tend to focus on the security from my end, the pen testing. You can flick me this question on LinkedIn or via email, and I will have a chat internally because the GRC team who sit over the other side will have a much better insight into that than me. Are there cybersecurity risks with AI tools? Yes and no, particularly with where you own the data. It depends whether you're running it yourself in your own environment and if they're sending that data anywhere else. I think I sort of covered that before. Hey, Kevin Hales. This is my former boss from Xero. Thank you for the great feedback, Kevin. Anonymous attendee, do you believe that the proposed disestablishment of the GCPO may expose government departments' weak spots when it comes to privacy and security? I don't know whether I can comment on that as a blanket, but I think any less privacy and security kind of professionals is a bad thing. I think, yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. Yeah. How can organizations in New Zealand possibly compete in the security space and prevent data breaches against the advanced techniques used by national states? It's very hard to, is the realistic answer to that. I'm sorry. We just have to do our best. Does security two-factor USB-C keys like the Yubico YubiKey really work to protect people's passwords and accounts? Yes, they do. That's the short answer. They're essentially unphishable by known techniques, not the same way that the hardware of the phone-based tokens are. What do you need to study to be a pen tester? There's a really great resource written by my former boss, Simon Howard. If you Google getting started as a penetration tester in New Zealand, LinkedIn, you will find it. He's written a great blog that he updates every year with a bunch of resources of things you can learn for both Red Team, which is offensive security, and Blue Team, which is on the defensive side. Aside from rage quitting, do you have any tips on how to convince higher ups to be more secure and privacy preserving? This is a really, really hard one. You just have to use as many words as you can. And it's so frustrating. I get it. I really do. And I think the unfortunate reality is a lot of higher ups won't be convinced. Put it this way, if you're in the private sector, if you can put a business case and put a value or a monetary cost on what a breach or a ransomware event would cost, that might get their attention more than just saying that we're going to be hacked. I think if there's a financial incentive to get it together, they will do it. Thank you, anonymous attendee, for the feedback. Michael Chang, what's the current status of SQL injection? Does SQL Server 2017 have any issues? It's not the SQL Server itself, it's the application code and how it relates to the database. So I think I have injected into those sorts of databases, but it comes down to the developers writing their code in a less than secure fashion. Any advice for someone getting into cybersecurity in a public sector environment? Take your time and learn as many things as you can. Cybersecurity is a really good second career, or a third career, or a 10th career in my case. But yeah, just take your time and enjoy yourself. Do you have any suggestions for threat modeling approaches? Yeah, I think Microsoft has a tool. I'll have to find the name of it. I'll look it up afterwards and send it. But yeah, we just use tooling, whiteboard sessions. Oh, here's a good one. This is the Privacy Act. Number 5, under the Privacy Act, organizations are required to take reasonable steps to ensure that the data they hold is secure from loss and inappropriate use. Oh, we've got more people raising hands. Cool, we'll get there in a minute. What would you consider to be reasonable steps? That's a really good question. It depends on the size of the organization and how mature they are. But for starters, enforcing a really robust password policy is a really good first step for any organization. A lot of breaches happen because of bad passwords. Enforcing MFA, making sure that your data is being encrypted at rest, which means that even if someone gained access to the server, they wouldn't be able to see what the data is. Making sure that, just industry best practices are followed. You don't have to go overboard, but there are a lot of kind of best practices you can follow. Yes, Greg, these slides will be available later. I'll forward them through to Emma. That's not a problem at all. What are your views on data removal businesses such as Incogni? I've not actually come across them. I'm assuming they're some of the ones who probably send cease and desists to be able to get your data off the internet. If it works, yeah, great, absolutely. And I guess removing data would really depend, on on what they're actually keeping and how they're getting rid of it. There's a concept in databases called soft deleting. Companies that require a robust audit trail don't really delete data, they just sort of hide it, because if they delete data but they have an audit requirement, they're never actually really going to get rid of it because they can't. But yeah, really good question. Cool. We had some people raising their hands. Who would like to talk first?
Jim, I'll just say it's Emma here. You know that, but no one else does.
Yeah, cool. Hey, Emma.
Because we're in the webinar, nobody else can talk except for us.
Ah, right. Sorry. Yes.
Like some evil kingdom. So if people want to talk or raise their hands, ask questions, they really just need to put it in the Q&A.
Sweet. Okay, cool. That's cool. Cool. I think that might be all the questions. I'm just going to see. Oh, no, I think another one might have appeared. Oh, no, we're good. Cool. Unless there's anything else from anyone, I think I might. Oh, hang on. Here we go. Two more. Azure or AWS offer better security in your mind? Really depends. They're much of a muchness in my experience. Azure have a really good security dashboard by default, whereas AWS charges for it. The Azure one is really good because it basically says, if you do these 15 things, you'll have a much better security posture, and a lot of them are literal checkboxes, which is really good. But by and large, they're very similar, and they have very much like for like sort of things. Yeah, great question though. Microsoft now recommends keeping the same strong password instead of resetting them and using MFA. Have you seen much movement in the space? Yes, there is one organization I've tested a couple of times who have very long passwords. I think they have a 16-character minimum with complexity, and I don't think they have any password rotation. And they enforce MFA both internally and externally. So yes, people are starting to move towards that. I think you're absolutely right. The guidance has changed, and people are starting to do it. However, winter 2024 will still get you into a non-zero number of organizations. So yeah. If you did a pen test for an organization that raised issues, what is a reasonable period of time for an organization to respond? The way pen testing works is they ask us to do it. We don't really come back and retest them. It's up to them how much risk they choose to accept. You know, if we came back a year later and they hadn't fixed anything and we did another test for them, we'd probably want to have a little chat to them about why they're doing these exercises if they're not really fixing anything. So it's, yeah, there's kind of self-guided, and it comes down to the risk appetite of an organization. Are there more or less security risks with using open source AI models? Great question. Don't really know the answer to that. I should have brushed up on AI security. It really depends. It really depends. I mean, there's always going to be the techniques where you can get the chatbots to, you can subvert the flow of information and get them to do things that the creators didn't intend. I think, the security risks are always going to be there. If you do something yourself, you do have a lot more control over where it's stored, where the data is stored, where the data is going, and that sort of thing. And also, if you're training using your own data to train it, doing it yourself is really good, particularly if you can do it on premise on a server that you control that doesn't, really talk to the internet. Oh, social engineering, email, and phishing. How much effort should agencies spend on this risk vector? That really depends on the agency. Spear phishing is still very common, which is when you go for a C-level or higher. We've done red team engagements where this has been particularly effective. Some of the bugs I've disclosed to Microsoft about Outlook and Word sort of play into this, so it's still very much a thing. It's a really good starting point for a robust security program. But a lot of internal tooling is really good now. I think Azure or Entra ID, which is Microsoft's new cloud-based access management, they now have, I think you can password spray internally, so you can test one password across to all members of the organization and see how many people have winter 2023 and that sort of thing. So there's tooling coming along in the space that system administrators and IT teams can use to sort of, figure out where the risks are. Should agencies ever use an app if the terms state the data will be stored anywhere but New Zealand? If so, which restrictions? I don't know the answer to that, so I'm sorry. I'm on the security side, not so much the privacy side. However, I would, if you have a privacy officer who you at the agency, I would suggest talk to them about that. Why do some companies not allow to use fingerprint login? It might be because biometrics at this point are still a developing field, and they can be spoofed in some different ways. One of my former colleagues, Ethan, was just presenting at a security conference in San Francisco, and his presentation was called "Your Voice Confirms My Identity," where he talked about using AI to generate voice bypasses for biometrics. So yeah, it's getting easier and easier to overcome biometrics in this way. What are the top 3 failings for public orgs you've pen tested? Great question. I think sometimes there's a real disconnect between who we pass the report to and how it gets to the people actually doing the work. And I'm not entirely sure that channel is as good as it could be, because sometimes we've come back to retest things and we've found the same bugs are there and we're not even sure that the report has got to the right set of eyes. So don't really have a top 3, but that's a really common thing that happens. Do you think New Zealand organizations should consider banning TikTok on company phones? If I had a company phone, I would keep very little on it. I would keep my MFA, and I mean, as far as a ban goes, that's up to the organization. But I personally wouldn't put TikTok on any of my phones, but that's because I don't like TikTok. I like Instagram. But yeah, great question. Cool. That was a good Q&A, 30 questions. Great job, everyone. What are the security risks of using AI? It depends. I'll give you a case study of why we wouldn't use it. We write client reports, and these reports will have sensitive information about how to compromise systems or web applications within the client's tenancy or otherwise. If we used AI to help proof or generate these findings, if we just went off the shelf with a ChatGPT-like model, we would be leaking all this critical, very, very private and sensitive data to something that we do not control the security of. So that's a main one, is if you're using a cloud-based version, even Grammarly does it. So I'd always be really careful about what you're putting into Grammarly. I'm not sure what Microsoft does, because they've got little AI plugins for Microsoft Word and that sort of thing now. But yeah, just securing your data and making sure it doesn't flow other places would be my biggest worry about AI. Are you seeing more cybersecurity risk associated with third-party providers? How do you best assure itself that the providers they're using are cybersecurity capable? That's a really good point. The software bill of materials, I think, is still ongoing in the US, which is exactly about this, about third-party and upstream providers. But if you're an organization and you're looking to get assurance from a vendor, I would suggest asking for a pen test report, asking for an assurance. I get asked quite often to provide an executive summary letter for a client that doesn't necessarily dive into the very specific things that we found, but it will give an overarching view of the robustness of the thing. So yeah, you can always ask. You can always ask what assurances and pen testing they've had done. Do password management tools like LastPass actually work in making your passwords more secure? Generally speaking, yes, because it means that you can, it's not so much about keeping your password secure, it's about the passwords that you use for applications. It means that you can make them long, unguessable, strong, and random. So LastPass is just one of many password managers that will allow you to have a strong password. So that's why they're good. Not, I mean, LastPass has been breached, and that does happen. Brian Smith, I am thinking of shifting career to cybersecurity /PT. Any recommendations on first steps? Really depends what you want to do. If you feel like you like hacking things, look at the red team side of the fence. Definitely look up the Simon Howard pen tester in New Zealand. I'm just going to find it right now and type it in the chat. Cool. For those interested, in the chat, there is the getting started as a pen tester in New Zealand. When I first started as a pen tester, I read the 2020 version of that, went out and hacked a bunch of things, but it has a lot of resources about how to, things to consider when moving to cybersecurity. Any thoughts or opinions on the importance of physical pen testing relative to non-physical? Again, it comes back to what your threat model is. We've done a bunch of physical pen tests. They're always really fun to do. They range from, dressing up as a plant watering person through to getting a really long stick to triggering, a door exit button. It really depends. It depends on where your organization is within that kind of security model. If you only have 5 people in a small office, probably not important, but physical pen tests can be important if you are a multi-footprint kind of place. And so really depends. Once you've nailed the large amount of electronic side of things, that's when you should probably start looking at physical. Do you think passwords still an issue with MFA in place? Becomes less of an issue. The number of times that I've done a password spraying attack on an organization and been stopped by MFA is a lot. So we will, for example, guess someone's password, but MFA will stop us from being able to log in. There are ways around that, but by and large, it's a very effective security control. With some cases of companies being breached due to the outsourced IT teams, have you seen that the performance threat landscape within house IT versus outsourced is different? Yeah, it really depends. It essentially comes down to you get what you pay for. Any common mistakes in setting up security with teams? That's a discussion to have internally about what your threat model is, whether you want people to be able to contact you externally, that sort of thing. MS Teams has a whole lot of configuration that you can look at, but I can't think of any common mistakes. Chat is disabled. Oh no, I'm so sorry. That's frustrating. I'm sorry. Don't know how to get around that. But yeah, that was just a link to getting started as a pen tester in New Zealand. But I'll also send it in there, or I'll try to. Yeah. Cool. Oh, I think I answered it on the answered section of the Q&A, so maybe you can see it there. How do people circumvent MFA? You know what, I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so, because I really like talking about hacking stuff. You'll know that Microsoft in general has a whole heap of ways that you can wrap up in 5 minutes. Yep, Microsoft has a whole heap of ways you can talk to your Active Directory. It might be Outlook web applications. It might be Skype for Business if you're still running that. It might be Teams. It might be portal.azure.com. Generally speaking, there's a tool called Trevor Spray, which is really, really good, and it checks what's known as conditional access policies. So when IT teams turn on MFA, depending on what their setup is, they may not turn it on for everything. So you can use tools such as Trevor Spray to find out where the gaps are. If you have a valid username and password, Trevor Spray will tell you where it's applied. Actually, I'm just going to pop it in the chat as well. It'll tell you where it's applied, and it'll give you a little example type answer. There you go. Cool. Absolutely brilliant, Declan. Thanks. Cool. All right, I think we might wrap up there unless there's any other burning questions. Thank you all, several hundred of you, for coming. That was really, really fantastic to see such a enthusiastic turnout. I really appreciate the support. I love talking about hacking, so feel free to befriend me on LinkedIn and send me any follow-up questions. I do really enjoy talking about cybersecurity, so sorry if I gave very excited vibes. Cool. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciated all your time. See ya.